Latin America and the Cold War go together like ham and cheese, peanut butter and jelly, or Vegemite and the trash. The US has long looked at the Western Hemisphere as its backyard, its sphere of influence, and this was absolutely the case during the Cold War as well. But sometimes things didn't always go the way it was envisioned or even planned. In 1958, an example of US plans to spread the good word of America went awry and played out on the streets of Caracas. I'm your host David, and today we are going to talk about Richard Nixon's 1958 goodwill tour of Latin America, how he was possibly almost killed by a hostile mob, and what it all tells us about foreign relations. This is the Cold War. So, on paper, it was supposed to be a friendly tour, a handshake campaign, a reassurance mission. A vice president showing the flag, meeting leaders, smiling for cameras, and proving that the United States still mattered in the hemisphere. In reality, it turned into something else. A motorcade boxed in by a crowd, a vice president trapped in a car while fists and stones slammed into the windows, a ceremonial wreath torn apart, rumors of US troops moving into position, diplomats scrambling to deny an intervention that many people already assumed was inevitable. Richard Nixon's 1958 Latin American tour became a public humiliation and a private revelation. It forced the Eisenhower administration to confront a truth that it had spent years sidestepping. Latin America was not a loyal audience waiting patiently for American leadership. It was a region with grievances, memory, and its own political weather system. And it did not need Washington's permission to turn violent. This is the story of that tour, what actually happened in Lima and Caracas, why US officials interpreted it the way they did, and how one chaotic trip helped reshape the Cold War's economic strategy in the Americas. To understand why Nixon's tour went sideways, we have to start with the atmosphere. By the late 1950s, the United States had two competing habits in Latin America. First, the habit of calling the hemisphere a family, a community, a shared project. Second, the habit of treating it like a perimeter, a defensive line that mattered mainly in relation to bigger struggles elsewhere. Political scientist Abraham Lowenthal describes a post-war pattern that Latin American leaders knew all too well. After the Second World War, Washington's attention focused on Europe and the Soviet Union, and Latin America was often treated as secondary, except when it came to regional defense. Latin American hopes for a Marshall Plan-style economic program for the hemisphere were disappointed, and efforts to win trade concessions through the OAS made little headway. That matters because goodwill tours did not take place in a vacuum. They land in whatever history people are actually living through. And in many countries in Latin America, that history included economic frustration, resentment of US influence, anger about American support for authoritarian regimes, and a growing sense that the rhetoric of partnership did not match the reality of power. The United States, meanwhile, was looking at the region through a Cold War lens that rewarded loyalty and punished uncertainty. In that worldview, unrest was never just unrest. It was a potential opening for Soviet influence. So when protests erupted during Nixon's trip, the immediate question inside the US government was not simply, why are they angry? It was, who is behind this, and what does it mean for the balance of power? In May 1958, Vice President Nixon was partway through a tour of South America that included Uruguay, Argentina, Paraguay, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela. The State Department framed the trip in conventional diplomatic terms. In a memorandum dated May 9, 1958, Acting Assistant Secretary William P. Snow described the tour as generally well received by governments and, quote, the responsible press, with economic issues dominating discussions. Nixon emphasized cooperation within US resource limits and stressed the importance of private investment. But behind the scenes, historians of US diplomacy have long argued that sending Nixon carried risk. Historian Marvin Zanizer notes that officials like Roy Rubottom had reason to note Nixon was unpopular among liberal and leftist groups, and that there was widespread dissatisfaction with US policy. Zanizer also suggests a more human political reality. Presidents often need to keep ambitious vice presidents occupied, and Nixon's trip fit that purpose, even if it came with obvious hazards. So Nixon went, and the administration expected that there would be some protests. What it did not fully anticipate was the scale, intensity, and symbolism of what would happen next. Snow's memo is revealing because it shows what US officials thought the tour was about: economic problems, trade relations, private investment, and the optics of a confident vice president moving across the continent. But even in that same memo, there is an early warning. Snow notes that before Lima, there had already been smaller demonstrations in Montevideo and Buenos Aires, and he suggests that they were, quote, inspired by communists. He then warns the Lima incident, quote, may inspire similar ones in Quito, Bogota, or Caracas. That line is important. It shows the logic that shaped US interpretation as events escalated. Protests were not only political expression. They were potentially contagious. And in Cold War thinking, contagious unrest was a security problem. The most dramatic early violence occurred in Peru. Snow's memo describes an anti-US demonstration in Lima that was presumably organized by a communist minority. Nixon was grazed by a stone thrown by a protester, and then, in an act that mattered because it was symbolic rather than strategically useful, a floral arrangement depicting the US flag was torn apart at the statue of San Martin. That kind of moment plays well in headlines because it is visual and simple. It looks like hatred of America in a single frame. So wait, why were people protesting Nixon, you may ask? Well, the protests can be situated in broader regional dissatisfaction and economic hardship. Nixon's tour was occurring amid rising anti-US sentiment and concerns about Soviet influence. Violent demonstrations in Lima were just part of wider discontent with US foreign policy and American support for authoritarian regimes. And now for a crucial point that we feel we need to point out, it's not that one was right and the other was not. Both of these things can be true at once. History isn't a zero-sum game, after all. Yes, communist organizers existed and did attempt to channel unrest. The Cold War was real, and political groups aligned with Moscow were active across the hemisphere. But if the anger had no fuel, it could not have exploded. A communist minority can throw sparks, but it cannot manufacture decades of resentment from scratch. Even the US response in the memo reflects this tension. Snow notes that Peruvian officials expressed regret, the government replaced the floral offering, and Nixon publicly said no US protest was necessary. That is diplomatic crisis management. It's also a quiet acknowledgement that escalation would be worse. Because once you start trading formal protests over public humiliation, you risk turning a riot into a rupture. And keep in mind that the tour was not over. But if Lima was a warning, Caracas was the collapse. By the time Nixon reached Venezuela, the political environment was already volatile. The country had recently seen the ouster of dictator Marcos Pérez Jiménez, and the country was in transition. That made it a target for competing narratives: national pride and imperialism, Cold War fears, and domestic factionalism. Nixon's visit to Venezuela was marked by an especially hostile reception, expressing deep frustration over US actions in the country. After landing in Caracas on May 13th, a mob of protesters had to be held back by US Secret Service agents to even get the VP and his delegation to their motorcade. Reports of a hostile crowd at his first scheduled stop forced the motorcade to divert directly to the US Embassy instead. Nixon's car, a closed-top vehicle rather than the open-top vehicles that had been used on previous stops, was attacked en route. His motorcade was blocked and protesters attempted to roll the vehicle carrying Nixon, and there was a real possibility that his Secret Service detail would need to use their weapons to protect the vice president. Local police declined to intervene, and the motorcade only escaped due to the intervention of either the Venezuelan military or the quick thinking of the US press corps, who used a flatbed truck to clear a path. Once ensconced inside the embassy compound, troops from the Venezuelan military surrounded the building, creating a secure perimeter for the vice president. By the next day, events on the street were de-escalating, but the violence had been severe enough that the US government had begun preparing for the possibility that Nixon might need to be rescued by force. This is where the title, Poor Richard, enters the story. In response to the danger, Eisenhower ordered US forces into readiness in the Caribbean under an operation nicknamed Poor Richard, effectively staging an option for intervention if the situation spiraled. And here is the bitter irony. The very act of preparing to protect Nixon threatened to make the situation politically worse for the Venezuelan government and diplomatically worse for the United States. Because after all, military movement is never just military movement. It's a message. The State Department's historical record captures how US officials framed the tour and the Lima incident. It also makes clear that Washington was already thinking about the possibility of copycat unrest across the rest of the itinerary. In the broader record around the trip, the key issue was not only what the United States did, but what people believed the United States was about to do. And that is the thing about intervention in the Western Hemisphere. You don't need to land Marines for the rumor of Marines to shape political reality. Once people think the US is preparing to step in, local governments can look weak, compromised, or dependent. Opposition groups can use the rumor as proof that the regime is Washington's client, and US diplomats can find themselves trapped in a contradiction. They want influence, but they do not want the optics of domination. Perception of troop movement became embarrassing for the Venezuelan junta and created a need for US officials to undo the impression of intervention. That's one of the central mechanics of US power in the region. Influence operates partly through the simple belief that force is available. But that belief, once activated, can delegitimize the very partners Washington claims to support. The violence of the trip became a policy event. Sennheiser describes the Nixon mission as a shock, something that accelerated a policy review already underway inside the Eisenhower administration. The key point is timing and momentum. Policy shifts were being considered, but the tour made it harder to delay and easier to argue that something had to change. Sennheiser lays out the kinds of changes that followed: movement towards commodity price agreements, expanded lending authority for international and US financial institutions, and support for the creation of an Inter-American Development Bank, along with other development financing tools. Lowenthal, writing later about US policy towards Latin America, also points to the late 1950s as a moment when Latin American problems forced themselves back towards the top of the US agenda, with Nixon's hostile reception a key factor, alongside Milton Eisenhower's impressions and the Cuban Revolution. Lowenthal frames this as part of a broader shift toward development lending and economic tools. This is where the story becomes quietly revealing about how policy actually changes. The riots were not only a problem to solve, they were evidence that could be used inside Washington to push a new approach. The tour's humiliation gave reformers leverage. A crowd in Caracas didn't write US policy, but it did make it harder to pretend the old policy was working. In public, Nixon argued that US policies were basically sound, but misunderstood, and that more propaganda and more exchange would help diffuse anger. But in reporting to the cabinet on May 16th, Nixon also stated that continued friendly relationships with dictators were a fundamental source of discontent with US policy in Latin America. That is an unusually direct statement for a Cold War-era American leader. It implies Nixon could see the contradiction. Washington wanted to present itself as the champion of freedom, but it often aligned with authoritarian regimes when it suited strategic interests. This is not a story where the United States learns a clean moral lesson and changes overnight. It's a story where the US tries to adjust tactics to preserve influence. Sometimes that means better public diplomacy. Sometimes that means more development lending. Sometimes that means quietly rebranding the same strategic priorities in a form that is more politically sustainable. To help connect Nixon's trip to a bigger pattern, it helps to borrow a concept from political science. Clayton Thyne's research on US foreign policy signals and coups argues that even seemingly mundane diplomatic maneuvers, including rhetoric and visits, can affect internal stability in Latin American states. He notes that supportive signals often have only marginal stabilizing impact, and that statements of support or high-ranking visits can produce backlash against the government the US intends to help. Nixon's presence in Venezuela was not simply a visit. It was a symbol, and symbols are usable. Supporters of the government could treat it as a validation. Opponents could treat it as proof of subordination. Protesters could treat it as an opportunity to perform resistance on a global stage. And that is the structural problem with public diplomacy in a region shaped by long memories of intervention. Even when the intent is reassurance, the signal can be read as pressure. In 1958, the signal chain was brutal. A high-profile US official arrives, protests erupt, the United States considers military readiness to protect him, Rumors spread, local legitimacy erodes, Washington tries to deny the impression of intervention, but the denial itself confirms that intervention was imaginable. This is not just a Nixon story. This is a recurring Cold War mechanism. Now, here is where the past brushes up against the present. And the point here isn't that 1958 and early 2026 are the same story. They aren't. It's a different era with different tools and a very different international context. But there's a familiar pressure point in the hemisphere that keeps resurfacing: how quickly US power turns into a question of legitimacy. In 1958, Nixon's visit wasn't just a visit. In Caracas, it became a public test of who had authority, who had dignity, and who got to define the relationship. And once the motorcade was attacked, the situation escalated fast enough that Washington started thinking in contingency terms. What if this gets worse? What if we have to protect him? What would that look like? Even the idea of US force hovering nearby shaped the politics on the ground. In January 2026, that idea became action. The White House administration launched a major US operation in Caracas that ended with Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, in US custody after a pre-dawn assault involving US military force. The administration presented it as a law enforcement-driven mission with military support, but the optics were unmistakable. A foreign leader seized by US forces on Venezuelan soil and transferred out of the country, while the US administration publicly framed the aftermath in terms of US control over what came next. Whatever the stated rationale, this is the kind of action that drags every old argument back onto the stage at once: sovereignty, international law, the UN Charter, and the long-standing suspicion that stability is just a nicer word for someone else deciding the rules. Analysts immediately raise the question of legal justification, not as an abstract debate, but as the core problem the operation created for the United States and anyone tempted to endorse it. In this region, US power has consequences beyond the immediate objective. Sometimes those consequences come from what the US does. Sometimes they come from what people believe the US is willing to do next. But either way, once that power is activated, events stop being only about the facts on the ground and start being about what those facts mean. Who looks independent? Who looks controlled? Who looks protected? Who looks compromised? And that's what Caracas revealed in 1958. And it's why moments of US action, especially dramatic unilateral action, tend to pull the conversation towards sovereignty and legitimacy almost immediately. Not because it's the same situation, but because US power in the hemisphere is never interpreted in a vacuum. So, what did the 1958 tour reveal, beyond the headlines? Well, first, it revealed that Latin American discontent could no longer be treated as background noise. Even US analysts and policymakers, confronted with public hostility, began to accept that anger reflected real dissatisfaction with policy, not just agitation by a hostile minority. Second, it revealed that Cold War influence required more than speeches and symbolism. Economic policy and development finance became tools of strategy, not optional extras. The tour helped accelerate that shift. Third, it revealed a structural hazard that still haunts US diplomacy in a region shaped by intervention. A visit is never just a visit, it's a signal, and signals can backfire. And finally, it revealed something almost psychological about power. A superpower can spend decades telling itself it's the stabilizing adult in the room, the necessary partner, the benefactor, the protector. Then, a crowd reminds it that history does not always agree. Nixon's 1958 tour was meant to calm nerves and project partnership. Instead, it revealed the opposite, that the relationship was already brittle and that public diplomacy can turn into a stress test when the public isn't buying the message. In Lima, the anger was visible. In Caracas, it became physical. And what happens next is what matters most. The US government immediately started thinking in terms of posture and contingency, because once a situation turns, the question isn't how do we look, it's what do we do if this collapses. That pattern, the way symbols became flashpoints and how quickly signals turn into assumptions about intervention, is one of the long shadows of the Cold War in the hemisphere. Sometimes the US doesn't even have to act for the fear of action to change politics on the ground. And sometimes the US does act and the arguments become even sharper. Legality, sovereignty, legitimacy, who gets to decide what counts as stability and what counts as interference. That's why 1958 isn't just an odd episode in Nixon's career. It's an early, televised glimpse of a recurring problem. In Latin America, US power is never just policy, it's also perception. And perception can turn a handshake into a crisis faster than anyone in Washington cares to admit. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss any of our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have attempted to rescue the bell button that is trapped in an overturned car with an angry mob attempting to rip it apart. Is this the end for our bell button? Tune in next episode to find out more. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.